Harlem, spring 1935. Two armed men wearing tailored suits step into the doorway of a private social club on West 139th Street, revolvers drawn, and tell Ellsworth Raymond, a Bumpy Johnson, that Charles a Lucky Luciano, the most powerful organized crime figure in America, wants him to step aside. The message is simple. Abandon control of Harlem's numbers racket, the underground lottery generating an estimated $300,000 a week in untaxed cash, or face elimination. The guns aren't metaphorical, they're pointed. And every man in that room understands this is the moment when Black Harlem's most feared enforcer either kneels to the Italian syndicate or ignites a war that could drown Upper Manhattan in blood. What Bumpy Johnson did in the 72 hours that followed didn't just surprise Luciano's emissaries, it forced the mob boss himself, a man who had orchestrated the murder of Joe Masseria and reshaped the American underworld, to recalculate, to hesitate, and ultimately to stand down from a confrontation he had assumed would be over in a single night. This is a reconstructed account based on public reporting, historical records, widely circulated eyewitness accounts, and law enforcement files that became public decades later. Some details, particularly the precise words exchanged in private meetings and the internal decision-making of criminal organizations, vary across sources. Where uncertainty exists, this account notes it clearly. What follows is the best available understanding of how one man's calculated defiance reshaped the balance of power in Depression-era New York and established boundaries the Italian Mafia would respect for a generation. The confrontation on West 139th Street did not emerge from a vacuum. For months, Lucky Luciano's newly consolidated crime syndicate, forged in blood after the Castellamar's War and the assassinations that followed, had been systematically absorbing profitable operations across New York City. Luciano, alongside Mayor Lansky and Frank Costello, had built what law enforcement would later describe as the Commission, a governing body designed to mediate disputes, allocate territory, and maximize profit across ethnic lines. The numbers racket in Harlem, a daily lottery where working-class residents placed small bets on three-digit combinations, generated staggering sums. Conservative estimates placed weekly handle at close to $500,000, with operators pocketing roughly 40% after payouts. Luciano's ambition was straightforward. Bring Harlem's numbers under Italian supervision, install cooperative black front men, and siphon the majority of profits downtown. Bumpy Johnson, however, was not a man inclined toward cooperation without leverage. Born in South Carolina, raised in Harlem, and battle-tested in the violent disputes of Prohibition-era bootlegging, Johnson had earned his reputation as an enforcer for Stephanie St. Clair. By 1935, Johnson had become the de facto protector of Harlem's independent black operators, a man whose presence alone could settle disputes and whose capacity for violence was both respected and feared. When Luciano's men entered that social club, a neutral ground where informal business was conducted, they delivered their ultimatum with arrogance born of recent victories. According to witnesses who spoke to investigators years later, one of the emissaries, a soldier named Anthony Little Augie Carfano, placed his revolver on the table and said words to this effect. "Mr. Luciano runs the numbers now. You can work for us, or you can leave in a box. You got 24 hours. Bumpy Johnson did not draw a weapon. He did not shout. Witnesses recall that he stood slowly, adjusted his suit jacket, and responded with a single question. Does Luciano know what happens when you try to collect from people who got nothing left to lose? Then he walked out, leaving the guns on the table and the emissaries uncertain whether they had just delivered an ultimatum or received one. Within the hour, word spread through every numbers bank, every policy shop, and every street corner operation in Harlem. The Italians had made their move. The deadline was set, and Bumpy Johnson had not blinked. What happened next was not a gangland massacre. It was not a midnight ambush. What Bumpy Johnson did was far more dangerous to Luciano's plans. He turned Harlem's economic engine into a political weapon, mobilized a community that the Italian mob had underestimated, and demonstrated that controlling Harlem's rackets would cost more, in blood, in money, and in public exposure, than Luciano was prepared to pay. The 72 hours that followed would determine whether the commission's expansion would succeed or whether Harlem would remain. In the words of one federal investigator, the one neighborhood the syndicate couldn't crack. Thursday, 11:45 p.m., Bumpy Johnson leaves the social club and walks 4 blocks east to a tenement building on Lenox Avenue. Inside, he meets with Stephanie St. Clair and 3 of Harlem's most successful independent numbers bankers. No transcript of that meeting exists, but police surveillance logs note that all 4 men left separately within 30 minutes and that each visited multiple locations before dawn. Investigators later believed this was the moment Johnson coordinated what would become a 48-hour shutdown of Harlem's numbers operations, a move that would deprive Luciano's organization of the very cash flow it sought to control. Friday, 6:00 a.m., numbers runners across Harlem arrive at their usual collection points to find locked doors and absent bankers. Bets are refused. Slips are not written. From 110th Street to 155th, from the Hudson to the East River, the daily lottery that employed hundreds and entertained thousands simply stops. Confusion spreads. Some assume a police raid is imminent. Others whisper that the Italians have already taken over and are restructuring operations. The truth, that Bumpy Johnson has orchestrated a voluntary blackout to demonstrate Harlem's economic solidarity, remains hidden. Friday, 10:30 a.m., a delegation of Lucianos men, led by Little Augie Carfano, arrives at a numbers bank on 125th Street expecting to begin the transition of control. They find the building empty. No cash, no records, no personnel. According to later testimony from a low-level associate who turned informant, Carfano makes a phone call and reports, "They're not here. None of them are here." The response from downtown is reportedly brief and profane. Friday, 2:15 p.m., Bumpy Johnson, flanked by 2 associates, walks into the same social club where the ultimatum was delivered less than 24 hours earlier. This time, no guns are drawn. Johnson places a leather ledger on the table, a detailed record. Witnesses later told police of every Italian-run business in Harlem that depended on black customers. Barbershops, groceries, speakeasies, loan operations. He does not threaten violence. He simply states, according to reconstructed accounts, that if the numbers war continues, those businesses will be boycotted, picketed, and economically strangled. One witness recalled Johnson saying, "You can take the numbers, but you'll lose everything else. We'll make sure of it." Friday, 6:00 p.m. The first cracks in Luciano's strategy appear. A mid-level Italian bookmaker on East 116th Street, whose business is 70% black clientele, contacts a Luciano lieutenant and warns that he's already hearing talk of a customer boycott. Another operator reports that 2 of his collectors were warned by community members not to return. The pressure is not violent. It is economic and social, harder to counter with force and impossible to solve with guns. Friday, 11:05 p.m. Luciano himself, according to multiple biographical accounts and law enforcement records, meets with Mayor Lansky and Frank Costello at a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. No transcript exists, but the decision reached in that meeting becomes clear over the following hours. Escalation is postponed. The commission's expansion into Harlem is not abandoned, but the timeline is revised. Luciano, a strategist above all, recognizes that a prolonged conflict with Harlem's organized black community would draw unwanted police attention, disrupt other revenue streams, and potentially cost more than the numbers racket is worth in the short term. Saturday, 8:00 a.m. numbers operations in Harlem resume. Bets are taken. Slips are written. The daily lottery returns as if nothing happened. But everyone involved understands that something fundamental has shifted. Luciano's emissaries do not return to demand compliance. No new ultimatums are issued. You are, sir. The guns remain holstered. Saturday, 3:45 p.m. A brief, tense meeting occurs at a location later identified by federal investigators as a restaurant on the border between Harlem and Italian East Harlem. Bumpy Johnson and a representative from Luciano's organization negotiate what amounts to an unwritten truce. Details remain disputed, but the core agreement, as reconstructed from later interviews and court testimony, is this: Harlem's independent numbers operators retain control of their businesses. Luciano's organization receives a modest tribute. Some accounts suggest 10% of gross proceeds in exchange for non-interference and protection from rival Italian gangs. Neither side claims total victory. Both sides avoid a war neither could afford. Sunday, morning word spreads through Harlem's churches, barbershops, and street corners. Bumpy stood up to the mob, and the mob blinked. The story grows in the retelling, but the essential facts remain accurate. Luciano's attempt to seize Harlem's numbers racket has been blunted, not by superior firepower, but by economic solidarity, community mobilization, and the calculated defiance of one man who understood that Harlem's strength lay not in isolated gunfights, but in collective action. By Monday morning, Harlem's numbers racket is fully operational under its original black leadership. Luciano's organization collects its agreed-upon tribute quietly and without fanfare. And Bumpy Johnson's reputation. He had faced down Lucky Luciano, not with a gun, but with a ledger and a community willing to stand behind him. The deadline had passed. The war never came. And the boundaries between Italian and black organized crime in New York were redrawn not by violence, but by a 60-hour demonstration of leverage that the Commission had not anticipated. Side A, Lucky Luciano and the Commission. Charles Lucky Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897, arrived in New York as a child and rose through the ranks of Italian organized crime during Prohibition. By 1931, he had orchestrated the assassination of Joe Masseria, ending the bloody Castellammare's War, and emerged as the dominant figure in New York's Italian underworld. Luciano's innovation was structural. He rejected the old world of boss's model and instead created the Commission, a multi-family governing body that included leaders from New York's 5 Italian crime families, plus associates from other ethnic groups, notably Mayor Lansky's Jewish syndicate. This new model prioritized profit over ethnic loyalty, mediation over vendetta, and expansion into every lucrative racket the city offered: gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, narcotics, and prostitution. By 1935, Luciano's organization controlled significant portions of Manhattan's nightlife, the waterfront unions, and much of the city's illegal gambling. His allies included corrupt police officers, Tammany Hall politicians, and businessmen who laundered illicit proceeds through legitimate enterprises. Federal authorities estimated that Luciano's share of New York's organized crime revenue exceeded $1 million annually, an extraordinary sum during the Depression. Luciano himself cultivated a public persona of cold calculation. He avoided unnecessary violence, preferring negotiation and economic pressure. When force was required, it was applied decisively and without hesitation. His reputation rested on a simple principle: align with him and prosper, or resist and disappear. Harlem's numbers racket represented an irresistible target. It was profitable, poorly defended by organized violence, and operated by black entrepreneurs whom Luciano's advisors assumed would either cooperate or be easily intimidated. The Italian mob had successfully absorbed Jewish and Irish operations in other parts of the city. Harlem, they believed, would follow the same pattern. This assumption underestimated both the economic sophistication of Harlem's numbers, operators, and the community solidarity that Bumpy Johnson could mobilize. Side B, Bumpy Johnson and Harlem's independent operators. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905, moved to Harlem as a teenager and quickly adapted to the neighborhood's rough street economy. He earned the nickname a Bumpy after a childhood injury left a prominent bump on the back of his head, a mark that became, in the retelling, a symbol of his toughness. By the late 1920s, Johnson had become an enforcer for Stephanie St. Clair, a black woman originally from the French Caribbean who had built Harlem's most successful numbers operation. St. Clair was known as Queenie for her regal bearing and ruthless business acumen. She employed dozens of runners, paid off police to avoid raids, and defended her territory against rivals with a combination of legal maneuvering and strategic violence. Bumpy Johnson's role was to ensure that St. Clair's competitors respected boundaries and that collections were completed without interference. He was not a flashy gangster. He dressed conservatively, spoke carefully, and avoided unnecessary displays of wealth. But his reputation for controlled violence was unmatched. Stories circulated, some verified, some exaggerated, of Johnson personally confronting armed rivals, of his willingness to absorb punishment, and of his refusal to back down regardless of odds. By the mid-1930s, Johnson had become more than St. Clair's enforcer. He was Harlem's de facto protector of black-owned rackets, a figure whom independent operators trusted to mediate disputes and defend their interests against external threats. Harlem's numbers racket was built on community trust. Unlike downtown gambling operations, which catered to wealthy clients in private clubs, Harlem's policy game served working-class residents who bet nickels and dimes daily. The dream of a big payout, 600 to 1 odds on a correct 3-digit guess, offered hope in an era when legitimate economic opportunities were scarce. Numbers runners were neighbors, cousins, trusted figures embedded in the community. The profits stayed local. Bankers reinvested in Harlem real estate, funded black businesses, and provided informal loans when banks refused service. This was not just a criminal enterprise. It was an economic ecosystem that sustained thousands of families. When Luciano's men arrived with their ultimatum, they threatened not just Bumpy Johnson's livelihood, but the entire structure of Harlem's underground economy. Johnson understood that his leverage lay not in firepower. He could never match the Italian mob's resources, but in his ability to weaponize the community's economic dependence on black-owned rackets and Harlem's collective willingness to resist outside control. His genius was recognizing that Luciano's strength downtown, intimidation, violence, political connections, would become a vulnerability uptown, where Italian operators depended on black customers and where a sustained boycott annualized. That's over $20 million in today's currency. Bullion taxed, unregulated, and controlled entirely by black entrepreneurs. Treasury agents, occupied with Prohibition's recent repeal and the shift to liquor tax enforcement, paid little attention to gambling. Harlem's underworld operated in a law enforcement vacuum, governed not by statutes, but the neighborhood's population density, strong community networks, and relative isolation from police protection made sustained occupation difficult. Moreover, high-profile violence would attract federal attention at a time when Luciano was expanding into narcotics and labor racketeering, far more lucrative and far more vulnerable to prosecution. An all-out war risked destroying the very asset Luciano sought to acquire, turning Harlem's numbers into a money-losing operation that required constant enforcement. The cost in blood, money, and legal exposure made this scenario the least attractive, despite its appeal to hardliners within the commission who viewed compromise as weakness. By Sunday morning, the evidence suggested scenario 2 was in motion. The question was not whether a deal would be struck, but what its precise terms would be, and whether those terms would hold. Within 48 hours of the informal truce, a development emerged that altered the fragile equilibrium. Police, responding to political pressure from Harlem civic groups disturbed by rumors of impending mob violence, conducted a series of high-profile raids on Italian-operated speakeasies and gambling dens in East Harlem and the Bronx. The raids were largely symbolic, minimal arrests, no major seizures, but the message was clear. Continued conflict would draw unwanted scrutiny that could disrupt operations citywide, not just in Harlem. Simultaneously, federal investigators from the Treasury Department's intelligence unit began preliminary inquiries into Lucky Luciano's income sources. These inquiries, unrelated to the Harlem confrontation, were part of a broader effort to replicate the successful tax evasion prosecution of Al Capone. Luciano's advisors recognized that a violent gang war in Harlem would provide federal agents with witnesses, publicity, and political justification to intensify their investigation. The timing, purely coincidental, nonetheless functioned as leverage for Bumpy Johnson's position. Escalation would not just cost money and men, it would invite federal intervention that could unravel the commission's entire structure. This convergence of pressures, community resistance, police raids, and the shadow of federal scrutiny created a narrow window for permanent settlement. Luciano, Ever the strategist recognized that accepting a negotiated compromise now would appear pragmatic rather than weak, particularly if the terms allowed him to save face and extract ongoing revenue. Johnson, for his part, understood that pushing for total victory might provoke the very escalation he had worked to avoid. The moment demanded resolution, and both men, hardened by years of violent conflict, chose calculation over pride. By late Sunday evening, representatives from both sides were meeting again, this time at a location that remains disputed in historical accounts. Some sources place it in neutral territory along the Harlem River. Others suggest a midtown hotel. What is certain is that by Monday morning, an understanding had been reached. Harlem's numbers operators would continue independent operations. Luciano's organization would receive a tribute, reportedly 10% of gross weekly proceeds, delivered quietly and without fanfare. Neither side would publicly claim victory. Neither side would issue statements. The boundaries were redrawn not by violence, but by mutual recognition that further conflict served neither party's interests. Bumpy Johnson walked away from the confrontation with his reputation enhanced, his authority in Harlem secured, and his community's economic sovereignty preserved. Lucky Luciano walked away with a revenue stream, a face-saving compromise, and a strategic lesson. That Harlem, unlike other neighborhoods he had conquered, operated by different rules and required different tactics. The guns that had been drawn on Thursday night were holstered by Monday morning. The war that had seemed inevitable never occurred, and the deadline, 24 hours, then 72, then extended indefinitely, became a footnote in a story that reshaped the balance of power in New York's underworld. The city moved on. Harlem's numbers runners returned to their roots. Luciano's soldiers focused on other rackets. But those who had witnessed the standoff understood that something rare had occurred. A black man in Jim Crow America had faced down the most powerful mob boss in the nation, and the mob boss had blinked. By tomorrow, the streets would remember. By next week, the legend would grow. And the question that lingered was not what had happened, but whether it could ever happen again.